When we speak of the Persian Empire, most people imagine splendor, marble halls, golden thrones, gardens stretching endlessly under the desert sun. It was a world of precision, elegance, and divine order. But beneath that shimmering beauty ran something far darker. For the Persians did not merely conquer lands, they conquered the human mind. They understood that a sword could end a life, but fear could command generations. This was not an empire of brute force, it was an empire of silent control, an empire that perfected the unseen art of psychological domination. Imagine standing inside the throne room of Persepolis. Columns tower like petrified trees, their carved capitals catching the last glow of firelight. Around you stand courtiers in immaculate robes, their faces calm yet unreadable. No one speaks unless the King of Kings commands it. No one breathes too loudly. Every gesture is measured, every glance weighted with meaning. Even a smile could be dangerous. To live here was to live inside the shadow of perfection, where silence itself was a language of survival. This empire stretched farther than any before it, from the edges of India to the shores of Greece, and yet its true borders were invisible. They were drawn not across mountains or seas, but across the psyche of its subjects. The Persians understood something profound, that to control the mind was to rule without resistance. Their laws were not enforced solely by soldiers, but by the terror of thought itself, the suspicion that someone was always watching, listening, judging. Within that atmosphere of divine surveillance, obedience became instinct. To the common man, the empire appeared godlike. The king was more than a ruler, he was the axis of existence, chosen by Ahura Mazda himself to uphold cosmic order. To defy him was not merely treason, it was blasphemy, an act against the fabric of creation. This fusion of religion and authority gave their control a sacred sheen. The people did not only fear punishment, they feared spiritual corruption. And so, the Persians discovered something extraordinary. Faith could amplify fear, and fear could strengthen faith. The mind became its own prison, and the prisoner believed it was holy. But every perfection breeds paranoia. The court of the Persian kings was a theater of constant performance, where trust could never be absolute. A single misplaced word, an unguarded glance, could bring ruin. The Persians understood that fear was not chaos, it was order maintained through invisible pressure. The greater the beauty of the empire, the more delicate its control had to be. Behind the fragrance of their palaces, behind the carved reliefs of kings granting mercy, there existed a machinery of psychological mastery, subtle, silent, devastating. The Persian Empire's genius was not in how it killed its enemies, but in how it made them destroy themselves. Through humiliation, isolation, and the constant erosion of certainty, they crafted methods that transcended pain. To the Persians, a broken mind was the ultimate victory, a symbol of their divine power to bend human will. They knew that torture was not merely an act, it was a philosophy. Pain was only the surface. True mastery lay in making the victim believe the pain was deserved, inevitable, or worse, eternal. This is where our story begins, not in battlefields or bloodshed, but in the quiet chambers of fear. Here, in the heart of the empire, the art of psychological torture was born. It was not invented overnight. It evolved through the Persians' obsession with control, beauty, and perfection. Every whisper, every ritual, every punishment had a purpose, to preserve the illusion that the empire was flawless, that rebellion was impossible, and that even the gods themselves approved of human suffering when it served order. The Persian Empire has long since turned to dust, but its influence endures. Every regime that ruled through fear, every power that twisted truth to control the mind, has drawn, knowingly or not, from the Persian legacy. They were the first to weaponize thought itself, to understand that the mind, once broken, never fully heals. Theirs was not just an empire of land and gold, it was an empire of fear. And within its shining cities, the darkest art of all was perfected, the art of psychological torture. There is a strange kind of silence that fills the Persian court, a silence not born from peace, but from fear. Every footstep, every whisper, every breath carried meaning. In the vast palaces of Susa and Persepolis, Power was both magnificent and suffocating. The King of Kings sat at the center of it all, an almost divine figure whose presence alone could decide life or death. Yet what truly maintained his empire was not his armies or his wealth. It was the invisible network of paranoia he so carefully cultivated. They called it the eyes and ears of the king. To outsiders, it sounded poetic, perhaps even noble, a symbol of the king's divine awareness. But to those who lived under its shadow, it was something far more sinister. It was the empire's nervous system, a web of spies and informants that reached into every province, every home, every heart. No one knew how many there were or where they might appear. A loyal servant could be an informant. A trusted friend could be listening for words of doubt. The effect was immediate and profound. People learned to guard their thoughts as tightly as their treasures. It is said that Darius the Great once remarked that order is not maintained by trust, but by vigilance. His vision of vigilance was absolute. Each satrapy, the administrative divisions of the empire, was ruled by a governor who held immense power, yet was constantly watched by royal inspectors. These inspectors could arrive unannounced, question anyone, confiscate records, or even execute a governor without warning if disloyalty was suspected. It was a brilliant and terrifying system, one that turned fear into efficiency. Imagine being a noble in this environment. You feast in halls of gold, your robes woven with the finest threads from Babylon, and yet a single rumor could end you. You do not sleep peacefully, for you never know which servant listens through the curtain or which guard's loyalty is already purchased by the king's hidden agents. The Persians didn't need to torture everyone. The possibility of surveillance did the work for them. Every man became his own interrogator, constantly questioning what he should say, how he should look, whether his loyalty appeared sincere enough. This atmosphere bred a unique kind of psychological torture, paranoia institutionalized. It turned courtiers into prisoners of their own fear, chained not by iron, but by uncertainty. There was no escaping it, because it was everywhere and nowhere at once. To live in the Persian court was to live inside a mirror maze of suspicion. The more you tried to prove your loyalty, the more your efforts were doubted. The king, ever distant and godlike, thrived on this balance of fear. It ensured that no one grew powerful enough to challenge him, and that devotion to his image became almost religious. Yet this system was not merely political, it was psychological art. The Persians knew that fear without evidence becomes madness, and madness breaks men faster than pain. The brilliance of their control lay in its invisibility. A whisper could ruin you, but you might never know who spoke it. A servant might vanish and no one dared ask why. The terror was subtle, almost elegant. It didn't explode, it simmered. It consumed slowly, silently, until every subject internalized it. Obedience became instinct. Silence became survival. At the heart of this empire was a man who ruled without ever needing to shout. The King of Kings rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. When he frowned, men trembled. When he smiled, they wondered what it meant. His silence carried the weight of divine judgment. Even those closest to him never truly saw his face as that of a man. They saw the vessel of Ahura Mazda, the keeper of cosmic order. This illusion of divinity magnified the psychological cage surrounding him. To defy the king was to defy the universe itself. In such an environment, trust evaporated. Fathers watched their sons for signs of rebellion. Generals suspected their aides of betrayal. The king's secret police collected not only intelligence but emotions. They learned what people feared most and used it to control them. If a noble was ambitious, they praised his loyalty in public only to summon him later for questioning. If a servant was devoted, they promoted him beyond comfort, making him visible enough to draw envy and suspicion. It was a calculated chaos, one that kept the empire's heart beating through anxiety. But the true genius of Persian psychological control was that it was self-sustaining. Once planted, fear grew on its own. Even when the king's agents were nowhere to be found, people imagined them everywhere. Rumors spread faster than decrees. A merchant in Babylon might lower his voice, believing that a royal spy stood behind him, though none existed. The illusion was enough. The empire no longer needed to enforce obedience. It had embedded obedience into the minds of its people. And yet, amid all this, there was beauty. The halls gleamed, the air was perfumed with incense, the people spoke of divine justice and the perfection of Persian rule. The contrast between splendor and terror was deliberate. It reminded everyone that order, divine order, had a cost. The Persians believed that perfection could not exist without control, and control could not exist without fear. Fear, to them, was not cruelty. It was maintenance of harmony, a tool to preserve cosmic balance. Those who lived within this golden cage learned that the mind was the true battlefield. No enemy army could break what the empire had already conquered, the human spirit. And so, as the empire expanded, its power grew not only through conquest but through psychology. It was not the swords of Persia that made nations bow, it was the shadow of the king, watching always, unseen, eternal. This was the Persian way of power, to rule by fear so artfully that it felt like faith, to create a world where silence was worship and loyalty was survival. For in the empire of the King of Kings, no one was ever alone. The eyes and ears were always listening, and even one's own thoughts could become a weapon turned inward. The result was a civilization that glittered like gold on the surface, but beneath it pulsed the cold, perfect rhythm of fear, the soundless heartbeat of a kingdom that had mastered the psychology of power. There is a moment in every empire when control demands spectacle, when the ruler must remind his people not only of his power but of the consequences of defiance. For the Persian Empire, that reminder came in the form of one of the most haunting punishments ever conceived: scaphism. It was not designed merely to end a life. It was designed to unravel a mind. A punishment so grotesque and slow that it transcended cruelty and became something else entirely, a psychological masterpiece of terror. The story begins, as many Persian horrors do, in the service of order. The empire prided itself on law, and treason was considered the ultimate sin, not only against the king but against the divine order of the cosmos. Death alone was too merciful for such an offense. The punishment had to reflect the enormity of betrayal. It had to destroy the traitor's body and soul, and through him, send a message that would echo in every heart across the empire. That message was simple: the King of Kings could command even the insects of the earth to avenge his will. Scaphism, whose name comes from the Greek scaphe, meaning boat, was reported by historians such as Plutarch as a uniquely Persian form of execution. But it was far more than an execution. It was an ordeal, a descent into madness. The condemned was stripped naked and placed between two hollowed wooden shells, shaped like boats, that enclosed his body from head to toe. Only the face, hands, and feet were left exposed to the open air. The boats were then tightly bound together so the prisoner could not move. At first, it seemed like a simple device of confinement. But the true torture had not yet begun. Next came the milk and honey. The victim was force-fed large quantities of milk until vomiting began, and then more still, until the stomach could take no more. Honey was smeared over the exposed flesh, on the face, on the eyes, on the mouth, between the fingers and toes, everywhere the skin met air. At first, it seemed absurdly sweet, almost ritualistic. But within hours, the sweetness became a curse. The scent drew insects from every corner of the earth, flies, wasps, ants, and worms that swarmed to feed. The condemned could not move. He could only scream. 4 days, the victim remained trapped in that wooden coffin, floating sometimes on a stagnant pond, exposed under the burning Persian sun. The insects crawled into his wounds, his eyes, his mouth. The honey fermented. The milk spoiled in his gut, bloating him, producing a slow, unbearable decay from within. The skin blistered, the flesh broke, and the insects laid their eggs inside. Death came not by sword or flame but by the slow disintegration of the body and the mind. But to focus only on the gore would miss the true essence of scaphism. The Persians were not content with physical pain alone. This was a performance of psychological annihilation. The condemned was not executed in secret. His suffering was made known. He became a living message, his agony a sermon on the futility of defiance. Even as he begged for death, death was denied to him. He was left alive precisely to feel every passing hour, to watch the sky change, to listen to the buzz of flies like a hymn of damnation. There was genius in its cruelty. The Persians understood something profound about fear, that it is not the act of dying that terrifies most, but the anticipation of death without end. Scaphism turned this truth into ritual. It was the embodiment of psychological torture, transforming the victim's own senses into instruments of torment. The smell, the heat, the sound, the paralysis, each one stripped another layer of humanity. By the time death finally arrived, the man was no longer a man at all, only a whisper of consciousness trapped inside rotting flesh. In a way, Scaphism mirrored the Persian idea of cosmic punishment. Zoroastrian belief divided existence into truth and falsehood, Asha and Diyari. To betray the king was to align oneself with falsehood, with chaos, and thus to fall outside the order of the universe. The punishment, then, became a restoration of balance. The traitor was not merely executed, he was symbolically unmade, returned to filth, fed upon by the smallest creatures, erased from both the physical and spiritual world. To Persian eyes, his torment was not cruelty but justice. The method also had a political function. News of a Scaphism execution spread faster than any decree. Travelers and merchants would whisper the tale in markets from Babylon to Sardis, how the king had punished the unfaithful, how the traitor had screamed for days before the gods took pity on him. The horror became a tool of statecraft. Fear traveled farther than soldiers ever could. Those who heard the story began to police themselves, careful never to speak a word that could be misunderstood. Yet there is something almost philosophical in the way this punishment was designed. It forced the victim to confront the most primal terror, the slow loss of identity. The insects, the rot, the endless light and heat, all stripped away the illusion of humanity. The condemned could feel himself being devoured by the world he had betrayed. There was no sword, no executioner, no mercy, only time and decay. It was as if the empire itself, patient and eternal, had taken upon itself the task of consuming him. It is said that some prisoners lived for several days, their cries fading into delirium. Witnesses reported that by the third or fourth day, the victim no longer begged for release. He merely moaned like an animal, his mind broken, his body unrecognizable. When the end finally came, it was less a death than a surrender, a quiet acceptance that there was nothing left to lose. The Persians, in their pursuit of perfection, had found a way to make pain transcend the body. Scaphism stands as one of the darkest inventions in human history, not because of its brutality, but because of its precision. It was not chaos, it was calculated. Every element had purpose. Every sensation was engineered to erode sanity. It was the ultimate reminder that the Persians were masters not only of empires but of minds. They understood that fear must be both visible and eternal, that the memory of one man's suffering could enslave thousands who never saw it. In the vast and glittering Persian Empire, where art, architecture, and order reached divine heights, Scaphism was the shadow that balanced the light. It was the whisper behind every law, the unseen ghost that haunted every act of defiance. To rule men's hearts, the Persians learned, you must teach them what it means to lose their humanity. And no punishment in their arsenal did that better than this slow, silent, psychological death, the moment when the mind itself became the battlefield, and fear proved more enduring than flesh. There are tortures that tear flesh, and there are tortures that tear identity. The Persians understood the difference, and they knew that the second was far more powerful. Where the sword ended pain, silence began it. In the empire of the King of Kings, one did not always need blood to destroy a man. Sometimes, the most devastating punishment came not from iron or flame, but from the slow suffocation of the spirit, the ritual of silence, the curse of shame. For the Persians, punishment was never only about the body. It was about the soul, the invisible essence that connected a man to his honor, his name, his gods. To lose that connection was a fate worse than death. Thus, the empire perfected what might be called psychological erasure. The condemned was not always executed. Sometimes he was made to live without identity, without voice, without dignity. He became a living ghost, tolerated but untouchable, existing in a state between life and oblivion. It was the ultimate demonstration of power, to strip someone of self, yet force them to continue breathing. One of the most feared of these punishments was ritual silence. When a nobleman or official betrayed the king's confidence but was too valuable or too connected to execute, he was condemned to a life where his words were forbidden. He could appear in court, he could attend ceremonies, but he could never speak. Servants would bow to him, but none would answer his gaze. If he attempted to speak, others turned away as though he did not exist. His meals were delivered in silence. His presence was endured, not acknowledged. The punishment was elegant in its cruelty. A man who once commanded thousands could be reduced to invisibility without a drop of blood spilled. His power was not taken, it was ignored, and in that ignorance, it withered. The Persians knew that to be unseen was to cease to exist. Silence, they believed, was not peace, it was obliteration. Another form of soul punishment was the parade of shame. In a society obsessed with dignity and divine order, public humiliation was agony beyond measure. The condemned might be paraded through the streets in tattered robes, their symbols of rank stripped away, their heads shaved, a gesture that signified divine rejection. They were made to walk through marketplaces where even beggars turned their backs. This was not merely a display of punishment, it was a ceremony of unmaking. Every Persian punishment carried a message about cosmic order. Zoroastrian thought saw truth as light and falsehood as shadow. A liar, a traitor, or a coward disrupted this balance. The purpose of shame was therefore purification. It was meant to burn away the falsehood through humiliation. Pain, in this context, was divine correction. The Persians didn't torture the soul for pleasure, they did it to restore balance between the man and the moral universe. To them, psychological suffering was a sacred fire. Consider the punishment of the half-buried man. It was said that those who offended the royal law without committing open treason might be condemned to stand for days in the desert, buried to their necks, forbidden to move, forbidden to speak. The sun blazed overhead, insects crawled across the face, and the silence was endless. No guard spoke to the condemned. No one offered water. The mind became the true executioner, whispering doubts, regrets, prayers unanswered. Many went mad before their bodies gave out. To the empire, this was justice served without blood, a purification through isolation. But perhaps the most haunting of all Persian psychological tortures was the ritual of invisibility. When a person's crimes were too complex for execution, perhaps a noble who had betrayed the king yet whose family remained politically necessary, the empire erased him symbolically. His name was removed from records. His house was stripped of banners. His servants were reassigned. He was forbidden to wear the colors of nobility, forbidden to enter temples, forbidden to speak the king's name. In the eyes of the empire, he no longer existed. Yet he lived. That was the torment, to be alive in a world that had already buried you. This practice reveals the extraordinary sophistication of Persian punishment. They understood the human need for recognition. To be seen, to be named, to be remembered, these were the anchors of identity. Remove them, and a person's mind begins to unravel. They become a ghost, walking among the living but belonging nowhere. This was a cruelty that left no scar, no visible wound, only the slow erosion of meaning. The ritual of shame was not limited to men. Women accused of disobedience, adultery, or sacrilege might be sentenced to isolation in dark chambers, where they were forbidden light or sound. Days turned to weeks in silence. Food was given without speech, without touch. Many emerged from such punishments broken, their minds clouded, their voices gone. To the Persians, such punishment was not mere vengeance, it was purification. The woman, now emptied of pride and voice, was considered cleansed by silence. In the grand courtyards of Persepolis, where gold gleamed and incense filled the air, such punishments seemed distant, almost invisible. Yet everyone knew they existed. Every noble, every servant, every soldier knew that disgrace could come not with a blade, but with a word, or the absence of one. The fear of shame was a leash far stronger than chains. It made obedience instinctive, silence sacred. Persian rulers, especially Darius and Xerxes, were masters of this psychological craft. They rarely needed to raise their voices, for their people were already conditioned to anticipate punishment before it was even spoken. The empire's beauty hid its cruelty perfectly. A man could stand beneath the carved reliefs of Persepolis, gazing upon images of kings granting mercy, while knowing that somewhere within those same walls, someone sat in the dark, forgotten by all. This was the Persian genius: cruelty performed with calm, punishment disguised as order, suffering disguised as purification. Their methods of silence and shame were not impulsive. They were designed, deliberate, almost ritualistic. By turning isolation and humiliation into sacred acts, they gave fear a moral face. The victim was made to believe that his suffering was not only deserved but necessary for the stability of the world. That belief was the final victory, the moment when the victim participated in his own destruction. When silence became law and shame became religion, the Persian Empire achieved what few empires ever could: absolute control without constant violence. Men disciplined themselves, women subdued their thoughts, and entire provinces remained obedient through the quiet terror of disgrace. In such a world, the whip was almost unnecessary. The true punishment was to be forgotten while alive, to exist without voice, without worth, without name. In the end, the Persians understood a truth that echoes even now, that to destroy a man's soul, you need not touch his body. You need only strip him of the right to speak, the right to be seen, the right to be remembered. And in that silence, in that void, the empire's perfection shone brightest. For beneath the golden mask of civilization, it was not mercy that ruled Persia. It was the art of breaking the human spirit without spilling a single drop of blood. Beauty has always been a double-edged weapon in human history, and nowhere was that blade sharper than in the Persian Empire. To the outside world, Persia was the embodiment of refinement, its cities adorned with silver fountains, its temples carved in harmony with the heavens, its people draped in fabrics so fine they shimmered like light itself. But beneath that magnificence, the Persians practiced an art far more exquisite and far more terrible: the art of cruelty as beauty. In Persia, punishment was not chaos. It was choreography. Pain was designed, deliberate, and above all, beautiful. In the court of Darius and Xerxes, everything had meaning: the color of a robe, the curve of a gesture, the rhythm of a sentence. Power was theater, and its performances required precision. When a man was punished, it was never random. His suffering was a lesson, a public display of control, orchestrated to reinforce the king's image as both merciful and divine. This balance of splendor and terror became the empire's psychological genius. The Persians learned that cruelty, when draped in ceremony and order, ceases to look like cruelty at all. It becomes justice, it becomes art. Imagine a grand square in Persepolis at dawn. The rising sun glitters against marble. Incense smoke coils through the air like ghostly silk. The crowd gathers in silence as the condemned is led forth, not beaten, not dragged, but guided with solemn dignity. The king watches from his elevated throne, framed by carved reliefs of winged guardians. When punishment begins, it is not chaos, it is ritual. Every motion, every word, every sound is controlled. There are no screams, only gasps, no fury, only awe. The scene feels less like an execution and more like a ceremony of purification. This was Persian statecraft at its most brilliant. Pain was not inflicted for revenge, it was staged as moral theater. The condemned, whether a thief, traitor, or rebel, was not only punished, he was displayed. The spectacle reminded the people that the king ruled not through cruelty, but through divine justice, that every drop of blood shed was sanctioned by the gods. The punishment itself became an offering to order, an aesthetic symbol of balance restored. Even horror, in Persia, was made elegant. Consider the punishment of the false witness. In a culture that revered truth as sacred, aligned with Asha, the divine order of the universe, a liar's crime was not against men, but against existence itself. Such a man might have his tongue cut and hung around his neck, his body perfumed, and his head adorned with golden bands before being paraded through the city. To the onlooker, it was a grotesque beauty, a contradiction that made the punishment unforgettable. The people did not see carnage, they saw divine symmetry. Falsehood had been silenced by truth, chaos replaced by order. The visual harmony was the message. The Persians were masters of contrast. They understood that terror struck deepest when cloaked in elegance. A punishment carried out in a pit or a dungeon was soon forgotten. But a punishment performed beneath a canopy of silk, before the throne of gold, lingered in memory forever. The contrast between serenity and suffering made the act unforgettable, transforming horror into spectacle. It was psychological manipulation elevated to ceremony. The empire did not merely torture bodies, it shaped perceptions. This aesthetic of cruelty extended even to architecture. The very palaces where rulers dispensed justice were designed to remind onlookers of the fine line between beauty and fear. In the reliefs of Persepolis, captives are shown kneeling in perfect calm, presenting gifts to the king. There is no depiction of struggle, no blood, no pain, only harmony. But beneath that serene imagery lies a truth. Those who disobeyed were erased from the stone itself. Their absence became their punishment. Even art became an accomplice in erasure. The Persians didn't need to carve their victims' suffering, they immortalized their obedience instead. There was, too, a calculated rhythm to Persian punishments. The spectacle of pain was often followed by acts of mercy. A condemned noble's family might be spared, or the king might personally grant water to the dying. These gestures of compassion, broadcast across the empire, did not erase cruelty, they amplified it. By juxtaposing horror with kindness, the king created the illusion of divine duality, both destroyer and savior, feared and loved. This oscillation between mercy and terror bound the minds of his subjects more tightly than any chain. Psychologically, this method was devastating. The people never knew whether to expect punishment or pardon, which made obedience reflexive. The unpredictability became its own torture. Every act of mercy reinforced the king's godlike power over fate. Every act of cruelty reminded his subjects that beauty without obedience was worthless. The empire's strength lay not in the sword, but in spectacle, in the manipulation of fear and awe until they were indistinguishable. Even foreign rulers were not immune to this theater. Ambassadors from Greece, Babylon, or Egypt who visited the Persian court often returned home in stunned silence. They had seen luxury beyond imagining, but they had also felt something else, something unspoken. The oppressive calm. The way the courtiers bowed too deeply, smiled too carefully. The silence that lingered beneath the music. They realized what the Persians had perfected, the art of appearing merciful while practicing absolute control. One of the most chilling examples of this fusion of art and cruelty was the punishment of false loyalty. When a trusted servant betrayed the king, he was not executed in anger. Instead, he was honored first. He would be dressed in royal garments, perfumed, and presented with fine food and drink before the entire court. Only at the final toast would the truth be revealed, his wine mixed with poison, his betrayal recited aloud for all to hear. He would die with a smile frozen on his face, surrounded by applause. It was elegance weaponized. The king's vengeance became a masterpiece. What made these punishments so psychologically effective was their beauty. The condemned was not simply destroyed, he was transformed into a living symbol. His suffering had meaning. The audience watching was not repulsed, they were awed. They saw the empire's cruelty not as savagery, but as the perfection of justice. The Persians understood that terror wrapped in grace becomes something greater, it becomes divine. This philosophy extended beyond punishment to the very psychology of governance. The king himself was a living paradox, merciful yet merciless, radiant yet deadly. His calm demeanor was part of the empire's control mechanism. By embodying beauty, he disguised brutality. By performing justice with ceremony, he made fear look sacred. And in doing so, he rewrote the human response to cruelty. People no longer feared punishment because it was cruel, they feared it because it was holy. In the Persian worldview, beauty was truth and truth was power. Cruelty, therefore, was not evil if it maintained order. It was art in its purest form, the art of domination. Each punishment, each ritual, each gesture of mercy was a brushstroke on the empire's vast canvas of control. The Persians had turned governance into theater, fear into faith, and pain into poetry. The beauty of cruelty was their greatest invention. It was not the iron or the flame that made the Persian Empire endure, but the delicate balance between awe and dread. In that balance, they discovered a secret older than time itself, that the human mind will accept even the most terrible suffering if it believes the suffering has purpose and if it is wrapped in beauty. In the Persian worldview, punishment was not simply a means of correction, it was a cosmic act, a restoration of harmony between the divine and mortal worlds. To understand the depth of their cruelty, one must first understand the Persian obsession with balance, the eternal struggle between Asha, truth, order, light, and Druj, lie, chaos, darkness. This wasn't merely a religious belief, it was the psychological foundation of the empire itself. Every decision, every punishment, every drop of blood spilled was justified as a battle in that invisible war between order and chaos. When the Persians punished, they believed they were not inflicting pain, they were cleansing it. And yet, the ways they chose to cleanse were unlike anything the ancient world had seen. These were not quick deaths or impulsive executions. Persian punishments were rituals of purification, designed to destroy not only the body but the stain that the guilty had brought upon the world. Pain became fire. Suffering became sacrifice. The victim's agony was transmuted into cosmic balance. In their eyes, this wasn't cruelty, it was restoration. To understand this mindset, imagine a temple courtyard at dawn. The condemned stands bound, surrounded by priests clad in white linen, their faces painted with ash. The king's voice is calm, almost reverent. The air hums with low chanting. When the punishment begins, whether it be scourging, burning, or the slow unmaking of flesh, the priests don't look away. They watch with solemn detachment, believing that the cries are not screams but prayers. The more the guilty suffer, the greater the purification. This fusion of faith and cruelty reached its most chilling form in punishments of elemental purification. The Persians used the natural forces, fire, water, wind, and earth, not just as tools, but as sacred instruments. Fire represented truth, water represented wisdom, wind represented spirit, and earth represented judgment. Each punishment was chosen based on the crime's spiritual corruption. Those who lied or defied divine authority might be burned, consumed by fire so that the lie within them was erased by the flames of truth. For traitors or oath-breakers, who had polluted the bond of loyalty, there was scaphism, the nightmare punishment that combined all elements at once. The condemned was placed between two hollowed boats, their bodies smeared with milk and honey, left adrift upon stagnant water. Insects devoured their flesh while the sun blistered their skin and the rot of the swamp consumed them from below. Fire, water, air, and earth all took their turn. To the Persians, this was not madness, it was balance. The sinner's corruption was offered back to the universe in the purest form of atonement imaginable, through decomposition itself. Even in this horror, there was order. Scaphism was not done in chaos or rage. It was performed with ritual precision. Servants would tend to the victim daily, not out of mercy, but to prolong the ritual. Food was given, wounds cleaned just enough to prevent death. The goal was not to kill but to transform. Death was too merciful. Purification required suffering that stripped away everything human until only truth remained. This was the cruel brilliance of Persian justice. They turned punishment into process. To them, it wasn't enough for the guilty to die. They had to experience their cleansing, to feel the gradual unraveling of their sin through pain. This philosophy blurred the line between torture and theology. The condemned wasn't merely paying for their crime, they were fulfilling a divine role. Their body became a vessel of redemption, their agony a message to the gods. Fire was considered the holiest of all purifiers, and thus the most sacred of punishments. Yet it was not used recklessly. To defile fire with unworthy flesh was a sin in itself. The Persians reserved burning for crimes that violated divine truth, blasphemy, oath-breaking, and heresy. In these executions, priests would perform elaborate ceremonies before lighting the pyre, asking the gods for permission to let fire cleanse what cannot be forgiven. The flames were treated as living entities, judges rather than tools. And as the condemned was consumed, witnesses would pray, not for mercy, but for balance restored. Water, on the other hand, symbolized cleansing from deceit. Those who had corrupted others, bribers, poisoners, false prophets, might be drowned. But this, too, was ceremonial. The condemned would be lowered slowly, their heads repeatedly submerged and lifted. Each breath became an act of confession, each gasp a cry for purity. The ritual was as much psychological as physical. It mimicked the act of rebirth, forcing the guilty to face suffocation again and again, until the final breath marked their release. Even burial alive, one of the most feared punishments in the empire, followed this pattern. It was reserved for women accused of betraying their sacred roles, especially priestesses or royal wives. They were buried in chambers with minimal air, water, and food, left to die slowly, unseen. This, the Persians said, allowed the earth itself to judge them. The soil became the silent arbiter, and the isolation ensured their shame would not contaminate others. What seems like cruel imprisonment to us was, to them, a sacred sentence, a literal return to the womb of the earth to be reabsorbed by creation. Psychologically, these rituals achieved something terrifying. They erased the boundary between morality and cruelty. By transforming torture into religious duty, the Persians ensured that even their executioners felt holy. The act of punishment was not an expression of hatred, it was devotion. Pain became sacred work. This absolved the empire of guilt, allowing unimaginable brutality to coexist with spiritual serenity. In this paradox, Persian power became untouchable. To the modern eye, these acts appear monstrous. But to the Persians, they were the highest form of justice, the universe correcting itself through human hands. Every punishment mirrored the cosmic battle of Asha and Diri, light and shadow, purity and corruption. When a man was tortured, he was not being destroyed, he was being restored. His suffering was seen as necessary, even merciful. It was not hatred that drove them, but belief. And perhaps this is what made Persian cruelty so enduring. It was rooted not in rage, but in faith. The calmness of the priests, the order of the ritual, the absence of chaos, all of it conveyed the same message. Pain was not random. It was ordained. The condemned's screams did not disturb the ceremony because they were part of it, music in the symphony of justice. By fusing theology, psychology, and artistry, the Persians elevated punishment into transcendence. They didn't just make people fear pain, they made them believe in it. To disobey the king was to fall out of harmony with the universe itself, and punishment was the only way back into balance. It was this philosophical foundation, not their armies or gold, that made their empire endure for centuries. In their fires, rivers, and earth burials, one sees not only cruelty but an echo of something universal, humanity's endless desire to make suffering meaningful. The Persians perfected that illusion, turning agony into ritual, horror into holiness. Their punishments were not merely instruments of control, they were mirrors held up to the human soul, reflecting both its darkness and its yearning for order. If the Persian Empire had one divine mirror for its cruelty, it was their pantheon, a realm where gods themselves suffered, commanded, and judged with terrifying precision. The Persians did not invent pain, they sanctified it. Their gods, like their kings, ruled not through kindness, but through cosmic balance, a balance that demanded sacrifice, obedience, and purification through suffering. To understand the psychology of Persian punishment, one must understand the gods who inspired it, beings who embodied the eternal dance of light and shadow, purity and decay, mercy and vengeance. At the heart of Persian belief stood Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the embodiment of Asha, divine truth and order. He was perfection incarnate, radiant, omniscient, pure. Yet, his existence was incomplete without his eternal adversary, Engra Mainyu, the spirit of Diri, deception, chaos, and corruption. The world, in the Persian mind, was the battleground between these two forces. Every soul, every breath, every act of justice or cruelty participated in this invisible war. In such a worldview, pain was never random. Suffering was the battlefield of the soul. A man's agony was proof that the divine conflict raged within him, that the light and the darkness were wrestling for his fate. This belief gave suffering an almost sacred dignity. When a traitor or heretic screamed beneath Persian punishment, onlookers did not merely see a sinner, they saw the Druj being burned away by Asha. Pain was the fire through which truth revealed itself. The kings of Persia, from Darius to Xerxes, saw themselves not merely as rulers but as chosen instruments of Ahura Mazda. They were the human embodiment of divine justice, entrusted with maintaining Asha across the mortal realm. To disobey the king was to disrupt cosmic order itself, an act of blasphemy that demanded not mere execution, but purification. This is why Persian punishments were so deliberate, so slow, and so symbolic. They were imitations of divine judgment. In inscriptions carved into the cliffs of Behistun, Darius proclaims, "By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am king. I am a friend of the right, an enemy of the lie." That single line reveals everything about Persian psychology. The king's enemies were not men, they were lies. To destroy them was not vengeance, but duty. When rebels were impaled, flayed, or drowned, their deaths were depicted not as acts of cruelty but as moral triumphs. The Persians believed that to preserve truth, one must sometimes annihilate the false, completely, painfully, beautifully. The gods themselves, in Persian myth, set the precedent. Ahura Mazda was pure, but his world was constantly polluted by Ingra Mainyu's corruption. To cleanse creation, he unleashed ordeals upon both gods and mortals. Firestorms, droughts, floods, all were divine punishments meant to test purity. Humanity, therefore, inherited not mercy, but endurance. In this theology, to suffer nobly was to align oneself with the gods. To avoid suffering was to resist truth. Priests taught that pain was a divine test, a crucible through which the soul proved its allegiance. This made the Persian people psychologically resilient and terrifyingly obedient. Even in agony, they believed they were part of something cosmic. When the condemned screamed, the crowd heard not despair but confession, a spirit purging itself of impurity. Thus, the line between religion and torture dissolved completely. Every punishment became a sacred reenactment of divine order restoring itself. The rituals of purification mirrored these myths. When a man was sentenced for heresy or deceit, his punishment often echoed the divine ordeals from Persian legend. If he had defiled truth with lies, he would be burned, as Ahura Mazda's fire burned away the corruption of Ingra Mainyu. If he had poisoned water or crops, he might be drowned, returning to the element he had desecrated. Each element corresponded to a divine principle, and to violate it meant to face that element's wrath. The king, in turn, became a priest, not punishing, but officiating a sacred rite. Even the architecture of their temples reflected this theology of suffering. The sacred fires of Zoroastrianism burned eternally, tended by priests who saw in each flame the embodiment of divine truth. Those flames were never extinguished, not even during executions. Punishments often took place within sight of temple fires, reminding all who watched that divine eyes were upon them. The condemned's suffering was witnessed not only by men, but by gods. It was spectacle for heaven as much as for earth. The Persians were not unique in linking pain to piety, but they perfected the psychological balance between terror and transcendence. Unlike the Romans, who punished to display power, or the Assyrians, who tortured to instill fear, the Persians cloaked their cruelty in divine meaning. Theirs was not the cruelty of sadists, but of priests. They believed that to cause pain in the name of truth was not evil, it was sacred duty. This mindset gave rise to one of the most haunting paradoxes of their civilization, the holiness of obedience. In the Persian moral code, submission to order was identical to submission to God. The king's laws were divine laws, his wrath, divine wrath. To rebel, therefore, was not just treason, it was sin. And sin demanded purification. The empire's psychological grip on its subjects was absolute because fear of pain was indistinguishable from fear of damnation. Ancient accounts describe Persian soldiers marching into battle not for conquest, but for cosmic duty. They believed that dying for Asha guaranteed eternal honor, while living deceitfully condemned one's soul to endless corruption. The battlefield, like the execution ground, became a stage for divine purification. Blood was not simply spilled, it was offered. Even death was aestheticized into ceremony. And this spiritual fatalism was mirrored by the king himself. Xerxes, for instance, was notorious for his calm cruelty. When one of his engineers failed to build a bridge over the Hellespont, he had the man executed, but not in rage. Xerxes first prayed to the sea, then ordered the waters whipped and branded with hot irons, as though punishing the element itself for disobedience. To us, it seems madness. To him, it was theology in motion, a human imposition of divine order upon chaos. The punishment was not for vengeance, but for cosmic restoration. This merging of divine order and royal authority created a psychology that made rebellion almost impossible. Every act of defiance felt like an act against creation itself. Every punishment was a public reminder that suffering was not just a consequence, it was a cosmic necessity. In this way, the Persians achieved what few empires could, the alignment of fear with faith and pain with purpose. The priests who witnessed executions saw themselves as custodians of spiritual hygiene. When a criminal died, they performed purification rites afterward, sprinkling holy water, burning herbs, and reciting hymns to cleanse the air of spiritual corruption. These acts reinforced the illusion that justice had not only been done, but sanctified. The Persian people were conditioned to see pain as medicine, punishment as prayer. Even the afterlife in Persian belief reflected this grim symmetry. Souls would cross the Chinvat Bridge, a narrow crossing suspended between paradise and the abyss. The righteous would pass safely into eternal light, the sinful would fall into shadow, their spirits consumed by darkness. Earthly punishment, therefore, was seen as a final chance for redemption, to burn away corruption before death, so the soul might cross the bridge unstained. Thus, torture became not damnation, but the last mercy. Psychologically, this belief system achieved a kind of total control. Pain no longer inspired rebellion, it inspired introspection. The condemned, facing agony, could still imagine salvation through suffering. And the spectators, watching in horror, felt reaffirmed in their faith. Every lash, every flame, every execution reinforced the cosmic order. The king was not merely enforcing laws, he was acting as the hand of God, sculpting human souls through pain. It is here that Persian cruelty becomes something far more haunting than mere brutality. It was not born of bloodlust, but of theology. It wasn't the sadism of tyrants, but the discipline of believers. In their minds, the gods themselves demanded these acts, not to destroy humanity, but to refine it. Theirs was a universe where light required darkness, and purity required suffering. And in that vision, serene, ordered, and merciless, the Persians achieved a form of spiritual cruelty no other empire could match. They didn't just torture flesh, they sanctified it. They didn't just kill sinners, they turned their deaths into sermons. Through the gods of pain, they found a way to make agony divine, and in doing so, they built an empire that ruled not only the bodies of men, but their souls. The fall of the Persian Empire was not just the end of a kingdom, it was the quiet, unseen death of mercy itself. In a land once radiant with beauty, order, and divine vision, cruelty had become sacred. The Persians had elevated pain to the level of philosophy, transforming suffering into proof of loyalty and obedience into worship. In their world, cruelty was not barbarity, it was justice perfected. When a civilization begins to believe that pain preserves truth, its end is already written in silence. Within the grand courts of Persepolis and Susa, cruelty was no longer chaotic or impulsive. It was ceremonial, almost artistic. Every act of punishment was carried out with the same elegance as a royal ritual. A disobedient governor was flayed alive not as vengeance, but as purification. The skin of his body would sometimes be nailed to the chair he once ruled from, a grotesque but deliberate reminder that power must be worn with virtue, or it would consume the wearer. The Persians saw this not as horror, but as balance restored. To them, justice was beauty, and beauty could not exist without pain. The condemned were never treated as equals, they were treated as lessons. A man impaled before the gates of a city did not simply die. He became a symbol. 4 days, his body would hang in the sun as people passed by, whispering prayers not for his soul, but for the empire's order. To witness suffering was to witness the reaffirmation of cosmic law. The Persians had succeeded in turning execution into liturgy, a ritual of reassurance, a public declaration that chaos was still under divine control. Yet what made their cruelty truly terrifying was not its brutality, but its serenity. The priests who read the divine laws, the soldiers who carried them out, the scribes who recorded the condemned's name, all acted with quiet conviction. There was no rage in their hearts, no satisfaction in their eyes. Their calmness was absolute. And that calmness was the empire's greatest weapon. For when cruelty is delivered without emotion, it becomes eternal, an institution, not an act. That is when mercy truly dies, not when men are violent, but when they are certain. The Persians had always seen themselves as guardians of Asha, divine order, truth, and harmony. Opposed to it was Diryi, the lie, the force of chaos and corruption. Every rebellion, every betrayal, every sin against the King of Kings was not a political offense. It was an assault on the universe itself. The punishment that followed was therefore not cruelty, it was cosmic correction. By breaking bodies, they believed they were repairing creation. In that conviction, they found moral clarity, and in that clarity, they lost their humanity. Over time, compassion became a weakness, mercy an indulgence. Even the noblest courtiers learned to suppress empathy in the name of balance. To feel pity for the condemned was to question divine justice, and to question justice was to invite destruction. Thus, silence became virtue, and obedience became survival. The empire's grandeur depended on everyone playing their part in this ritual of control, from the lowest servant to the highest noble. And yet, beneath that immaculate order, decay had already begun. The same belief system that unified the Persian world slowly turned inward, poisoning itself. When pain becomes law, it spares no one. The kings who once claimed divine wisdom became prisoners of their own ideology. To appear merciful was to appear weak. To forgive was to invite rebellion. So they became harsher, more suspicious, more alone. In the golden halls of Persepolis, paranoia ruled more fiercely than any army. The king could trust no one, not his satraps, not his generals, not even his bloodline. Whispers of conspiracy were answered with public executions, confessions carved out through torment. The empire that once controlled millions through awe and reverence now ruled through pure, unrelenting fear. The very psychology that had kept the empire stable had transformed into its most lethal toxin. As cruelty became institutionalized, its presence spread beyond the palace walls. It shaped the minds of ordinary citizens. Parents taught obedience as survival, not as virtue. Servants learned to smile without sincerity, to hide their thoughts like contraband. Even religion became a performance. People prayed not from devotion, but from terror of divine punishment. In such a world, the soul itself withers. The flame of Ahura Mazda, which once symbolized purity and enlightenment, began to feel different. To the Persians of later generations, that sacred fire was no longer comforting. It was watchful. It judged. The gods themselves had become agents of surveillance. Priests preached righteousness, but behind their chants was the cold breath of fear. The empire still shone like gold from afar, but within, the light had become unbearable. This was the final transformation, the moment when cruelty ceased to be a tool and became an identity. The Persians no longer saw pain as a means to preserve order, they saw it as proof of divine authority. The more they punished, the more they convinced themselves they were serving truth. But truth without compassion is only tyranny disguised as justice. And when tyranny wears the mask of divinity, there is no limit to what it will justify. The empire no longer needed enemies, it created them. Suspicion became a way of life. Anyone could be guilty. A servant who hesitated to bow, a soldier who looked away too soon, a noble who failed to praise the king loudly enough, all could be accused of betrayal. The machinery of fear kept itself alive by consuming the very people it was built to protect. It is no wonder, then, that by the time Alexander's armies swept across Persia, the empire was already hollow. The walls stood tall, but their foundations were made of silence. The people had forgotten how to speak without trembling. The King of Kings, once the living reflection of divine truth, had become the loneliest man alive, surrounded by beauty, but haunted by distrust. The empire that once prided itself on order had drowned in its own perfection. When cruelty becomes order, there is no room for forgiveness. When fear becomes faith, mercy cannot survive. That was the tragedy of the Persian Empire. It was not destroyed by outsiders, but by its own brilliance. Its perfection turned to paranoia, its beauty to burden, its justice to horror. In their pursuit of divine order, the Persians killed the one thing that made their civilization truly divine: compassion. In the end, the death of mercy was not marked by blood, but by silence. It was the silence of priests who believed their cruelty was sacred, the silence of courtiers too afraid to question it, and the silence of victims who died convinced that their suffering had purpose. That silence is what still echoes through time, the last voice of an empire that perfected control, and in doing so, destroyed itself. The Persian Empire has long since turned to dust, yet its shadow lingers in the human mind. It was more than a kingdom, it was a blueprint for how fear could be made sacred, how beauty could disguise cruelty. The Persians understood that pain, when wrapped in ceremony, could become obedience. That lesson did not fade with their palaces. It traveled quietly through history, reborn in every empire that ruled not just bodies, but souls. Their legacy is not written in stone walls or royal decrees, but in the way power still speaks today, in whispers of order, in the silence of submission. The Persians perfected the illusion that cruelty could maintain balance, that fear could preserve harmony. And even now, that illusion survives. Each time justice becomes spectacle, each time truth bends to control, we live again beneath the shadow of the great kings. The ruins of Persepolis stand silent under the burning sky, but if one listens closely, the stones seem to breathe. They remember the screams that once echoed through marble halls, the minds broken not by blades but by belief. Their story remains a warning carved into eternity. When pain becomes divine, and mercy dies in silence, civilization itself begins to decay.